Imagine this. It's 1952. You are a parent in America, and summer has become the most terrifying time of year. You don't let your kids swim in public pools. You pull them out of movie theaters. You watch for the signs, the stiff neck, the sudden fever, the strange weakness in the legs, because you know that polio doesn't knock before it enters. It just takes. It takes without warning, without mercy, and without a cure. And you know that if it takes your child, there is a good chance your child will never walk again, or breathe on their own again. That was real. That was America in the early 1950s. And then one man, working in a lab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, changed everything. His name was Jonas Salk. And when the moment came to claim credit, to claim his fortune, to lock down the patent on what historians have estimated could have been worth billions of dollars, he looked into a camera, looked at all of America, and said something that nobody expected, something that still echoes today. This is that story. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because Jonas Salk is one of those Americans who deserves far more than a footnote in a textbook. He was born on October 28, 1914, in New York City, the son of Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who'd come to this country with nothing. No formal education, no connections, no money. What they had was a fierce, almost relentless belief that their children would be different, that their children would study, would rise, would matter. And Jonas, the eldest of three boys, took that seriously from the very beginning. By the time he was 12 years old, he had already enrolled in Townsend Harris High School, a rigorous public school for intellectually gifted students in New York City, and he had already made up his mind that he was going to do something with his life that meant something, not just something comfortable, something that counted. He was 15 years old when he entered the City College of New York. 15! He earned his medical degree from New York University School of Medicine in 1939. And then, here's the first thing that tells you exactly who Jonas Salk was. He decided not to practice medicine, not to open a private practice, not to build a comfortable career as a physician. He chose research. He chose the slow, unglamorous, frequently humiliating work of trying to understand viruses, because he believed that was where he could do the most good. There's a lesson in that choice that deserves a moment of real acknowledgement. This was a young man from a poor immigrant family, someone who had worked incredibly hard to earn a medical degree, someone who could have had financial security and a respected career, and he walked away from that. He walked toward uncertainty, toward lab benches and failed experiments and the judgment of his scientific peers, because he believed that was where he needed to be. He did early work on influenza vaccines, collaborating with a mentor at the University of Michigan who helped develop a flu vaccine for American troops during World War II. That experience taught Salk something critical, something that would define his entire career and ultimately lead to one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history. He learned that you didn't have to use a live virus to build immunity. You could use a killed virus, a virus that had been inactivated, and still trigger the body's immune response. That idea sounds almost simple when you say it now, but in the early 1950s, it was considered borderline heretical by most of the scientific establishment. The reigning consensus was that effective vaccines had to use live, weakened viruses. Anything else, the experts said, simply wouldn't work. Salk disagreed. In 1947, he was appointed director of the Virus Research Laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. And that is where the real work began. For 7 years of work that most people have no idea happened in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Jonas Salk and his team tried to crack the code of polio. 7 years of growing and cataloging different strains of the polio virus. 7 years of failed attempts, of dead ends, of colleagues in the scientific community questioning his approach, questioning his methods, questioning his credentials. Albert Sabin, the other major polio researcher of the era, a formidable scientist in his own right, called Salk a mere kitchen chemist. That's what you were dealing with. Not just a disease, not just the pressure of millions of parents whose children were at risk, but also the institutional skepticism of the scientific world, which can be as brutal and as political as any boardroom. Let me pause here to tell you what polio actually was, because I think we've lost the visceral reality of it. Poliomyelitis is a viral disease that attacks the nervous system and can cause paralysis, sometimes partial, sometimes total, sometimes temporary, and sometimes permanent. The iron lung, that terrifying metal cylinder that encased a patient's body and mechanically forced their lungs to breathe, became the defining image of the disease. Children who survived polio sometimes spent years in those machines. The luckier ones wore heavy metal braces on their legs and learned to walk with crutches. The unluckiest ones didn't survive at all. According to historical records, polio paralyzed tens of thousands of Americans every year during the epidemic years of the 1940s and 1950s. The 1952 outbreak was the worst in American history, the worst on record. In the post-World War II era, public opinion polls found that the only thing Americans feared more than polio was nuclear war. Think about that for a second. Nuclear war in polio. That is the company this disease kept in the American imagination. And here is something you should know that deepens the context enormously. One of the reasons the fight against polio was so personal, so woven into the fabric of American civic life, was because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR, who led America through the Great Depression and through the Second World War, contracted polio in 1921 at the age of 39. He never walked unassisted again. He used a wheelchair for the rest of his life, though his team and he himself took extraordinary measures to conceal the full extent of his disability from the public. Roosevelt understood the stigma. He also understood the stakes. And before he died in 1945, he had already established the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the organization that would become known for one of the most remarkable grassroots fundraising campaigns in American history, the March of Dimes. Ordinary Americans, tens of millions of them, mailed literal dimes to the White House to fund polio research. Over the course of the campaign, more than 80 million Americans donated money to the effort. 80 million people, not corporations, not foundations, people. That money funded Jonas Salk. That money paid for 7 years of research in Pittsburgh. And when it came time to test the vaccine that Salk had developed, a killed virus vaccine that the establishment said couldn't possibly work, the clinical trial that followed became one of the largest and most elaborate public health experiments in American history. More than 1.8 million children across the country participated in the field trials. Doctors, public health workers, teachers, and volunteers by the tens of thousands were involved in tracking, recording, and monitoring the results. These children, known as polio pioneers, rolled up their sleeves and received either Salk's vaccine or a placebo. Their parents signed consent forms, not knowing which their children had received. They trusted the process. They trusted science. They trusted that something better was on the way. April 12, 1955. That is the date that changed everything. That is the date when the results of the clinical trials were officially announced and Jonas Salk's vaccine was declared safe, effective, and potent against polio. The announcement was made at the University of Michigan, and the reaction across the country was immediate and overwhelming. Church bells rang in cities, strangers cried in the streets. Schools let students out early. Restaurant owners and shop proprietors wept openly. People who'd lived through years of summer terror, years of keeping their children home, of watching iron lungs arrive at hospitals, of attending funerals for children who should have had decades ahead of them. Those people exhaled for the first time in years. One journalist described the scene as something approaching a national religious experience. For millions of American parents, April 12, 1955 was the day the fear ended. And then something happened that nobody talks about enough. On that very same day, April 12, 1955, the legendary CBS newsman Edward R. Murrow sat down with Jonas Salk for a television interview. Murrow was the most respected broadcast journalist in the country. This was the man who had reported from London during the Blitz, who had helped bring down Joseph McCarthy, who had more credibility in a single sentence than most institutions had in a lifetime. And Murrow asked Salk a simple question: who owned the patent on the polio vaccine? The question was not trivial. A vaccine of this magnitude in this era, with this level of public demand, a successful patent could have made Salk one of the wealthiest men in America. It could have generated what historians have estimated might have been billions of dollars over its lifetime. It was a reasonable question. And here is what Jonas Salk said. Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Could you patent the sun? Now, in this channel is about honesty, so let's be honest. The full story of the patent is more complicated than that single quotation suggests. Lawyers for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis had, in fact, looked into the possibility of patenting the vaccine. Historians and legal scholars who have since examined the Foundation's archives, including Jane Smith in her detailed history of the Salk vaccine, have found evidence suggesting that the legal conclusion was that the vaccine likely would not have met the novelty requirements for a patent under the standards of the day. So it is possible, some historians argue, that there was no patent not only because Salk chose not to pursue one, but also because one might not have been grantable. That is a legitimate historical debate, but here is what is not debatable. Jonas Salk personally opposed patenting the vaccine. He was on the record opposing it. The Foundation had a similar view, that the American public had already funded this vaccine through their dimes in their trust, and to then charge them again through a patent would be a kind of betrayal. Whether or not a patent would have succeeded legally, the moral decision was made. The vaccine belonged to the people. And that decision, whatever its full legal backstory, made the vaccine widely available, cheaply manufacturable, and rapidly distributable in a way that changed the trajectory of a disease. Between 1955 and 1962, according to historical data tracked by public health researchers, annual polio cases in the United States fell from approximately 45,000 to under 1,000. From 45,000 to under 1,000 in 7 years. By 1994, the Americas were declared polio-free by the World Health Organization. The disease that had paralyzed a president and terrified a generation of parents was, in the Western Hemisphere, effectively gone. And Jonas Salk? He never won the Nobel Prize. He was never admitted to the National Academy of Sciences, a snub that many of his admirers have described as one of the great institutional failures of American scientific history. Part of this was professional jealousy. Part of it was the ongoing antagonism from Albert Sabin, who continued to dismiss Salk's killed virus approach even after the vaccine's success. Part of it was the complicated dynamics of scientific recognition, which does not always follow a straight line from achievement to honor. There was also the Qatar incident, a crisis that erupted just weeks after the vaccine was declared safe, when contaminated batches from one laboratory led to cases of polio being traced back to the vaccine itself. The federal government ordered vaccinations temporarily halted. It was a genuine catastrophe for public confidence, and Salk bore the weight of it, even though the failure was in manufacturing, not in the science. He was devastated. He took it personally. He spent months working with health authorities to fix the problem, and when the vaccine program resumed in the fall of 1955, it did so with renewed safety protocols. Outside of that contaminated batch, not a single case of polio was ever attributed to Salk's vaccine. In 1962, Salk founded the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, a research institution that became one of the most celebrated centers of biological science in the world and that continues to operate today. He spent his later years working on multiple sclerosis, cancer, and in the 1980s and early 1990s on HIV and AIDS. He never stopped. He never decided he had done enough and could rest on what April 12, 1955 had given him. He kept going because that was who he was. He died on June 23, 1995 in La Jolla. He was 80 years old. Here is the part that gets me every time I think about it. Jonas Salk spent 7 years in a laboratory in Pittsburgh, fighting skepticism from the most respected voices in his field, working on behalf of tens of millions of parents who were afraid every summer for their children's lives. He found the answer. He tested it at a scale almost impossible to imagine. He delivered the proof on April 12, 1955, and then, when the whole country was watching, when the question of the century was asked, "Who owns this?" he said, "The people." He said, "You already paid for this with your dimes and your trust and your children who rolled up their sleeves." He said, "Could you patent the sun?" And then he went back to work. Now, is the full story messier than that perfect quote? Yes, it always is. Historians will debate the legal details of the patent for as long as they debate anything.
But the spirit of what Jonas Salk represented, the idea that a scientist could be motivated by service rather than profit, that the greatest discoveries belong to the civilization that made them possible, that spirit is real, and it is deeply, genuinely American. Not in a naive way, not in a chest-thumping, mythology-building way, but in the way that matters. A kid from a poor immigrant family in New York City, educated in public schools, funded by the dimes of ordinary people, working in a mid-sized city in Pennsylvania that nobody outside of Pittsburgh would have chosen for a story like this. That kid saved the world, and then he gave it away. That is a story worth knowing. That is a story worth carrying with you. I want to ask you something before you go, and I'm genuinely curious about this. Jonas Salk is one of the most consequential Americans of the 20th century, and most people can barely tell you the basic outline of what he did, let alone the details. Why do you think that is? Is it that medicine doesn't get the same cultural storytelling that war or politics does? Is it that scientists don't fit the hero narratives we're used to? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because I think about this question a lot when I'm digging through stories like this one, and I don't have a clean answer. If this story meant something to you, share it. Seriously, send it to someone who needs to hear it, because Jonas Salk deserved his name in lights a long time ago, and the least we can do is say it out loud. Subscribe if you want more American history that somehow never made it into your textbooks. Next time, we're going to look at another American whose contribution to the modern world was so massive that experts still argue about how to measure it, and whose name you probably don't know at all. I'll see you then.